Welcome to this set of mini lectures on plant diversity, climate change, and conservation, The View from California. I'm David Ackerley, a professor at UC Berkeley and Dean of our Rausser College of Natural Resources. There are 7 units in this series, starting with California history, running through a background on climate and vegetation in California, climate change, how biodiversity responds to climate change, looking at questions that are closest to my research about landscapes, microclimates, and climate refugia, and then how conservation practice is changing in the face of these things. And as we go along, you will see the bolded unit indicating where we are in the series. Just to get ourselves grounded, I do a lot of work with computer modeling and this kind of the research work we do. I also love being in the field. Almost all of these are my photographs, and just a reminder for all of us of what it is we're here to think about and talk about. We can, when we start looking at data and maps and things, we sometimes lose track of just the pictures, the beautiful pictures of the spectacular biodiversity of the California flora. And just always like to start and share that. So just north of here, that map in the upper right corner shows the Bay Area, and then that arrow up to Clear Lake. Clear Lake is a very geologically stable, quite unusual, and a very old lake, and one of the largest freshwater lakes entirely within the state of California. That is the mountain behind there is covered in a lot of oaks and some pine trees. And when oaks and pines reproduce, they're both wind pollinated. They generate a lot of pollen. Some people don't appreciate that pollen, which spreads out in the wind. Of course, the goal of the trees is to have that pollen land on other trees to reproduce and make pine cones or seeds or acorns. But a lot of it just disperses on the wind, and much of it will land on the surface of the lake and sink down, and layer upon layer. The bottom of a lake such as this records a signal of how vegetation has changed through time. And these are very important parts of our understanding of the history of vegetation all around the world. We don't have a lot of them in California, though, because we don't have a lot of old, stable lakes as they do in wetter parts of the world, in part. This was work that was done many years ago, a USGS researcher. It is being redone, and in the next few years, we hope to see an updated pollen core, and we may be adjusting some of the dates, but here's the big picture. The way to read this graph is on the left is time with the present at the top, going back all the way to 100,000 years and beyond. The left is the percentage of oak pollen. So the more that red line pops out, that means there's more oak in those layers of sediment in the bottom of the lake. In the middle is the amount of pine pollen. And then on the right are other conifers, which include some of the cypresses, potentially redwood. There's some where you can't distinguish the different types of pollen. And this line here is the last glacial maximum, around 18,000 years ago, so the height of the last ice age. I want to draw your attention first to way back at 100,000 years ago. This is a period called the Eemian. This is the last time that it was warm in California before the current ice age. And a really interesting time because there were no people in the Western Hemisphere in the way that anthropologists and archaeologists understand the record. Boy, wouldn't we love to know what California looked like when it was warm and we didn't have the human influences. What was the fire regime? There were the mega herbivores. We just don't really know what California looks like without people, because people have been part of California history throughout the last 15 to 20,000 years ago, and shaped everything we know about the environment today. So it's always worth sort of thinking about that question of what it might have looked like, but really we have very little understanding of what that landscape looked like. So I'm going to, in this first unit, I'm going to actually try to run through my own view of the environmental history of California very quickly, starting with the last ice age, and jumping through in what I see as sort of eight periods. Some of these are very long and cover a lot of history, a lot of things were happening, but we just want to see some major themes in the history of California, its people, and how that some of the influences on the environment and the vegetation. So let's zoom back in on that pollen core. So here we are 18,000 years ago, and the mountain around Clear Lake was mostly a range of conifers, right? And then the ice, there's no ice here. Remember, the ice is in the Sierra and it's way up in Canada. It's just cooler. So it starts to get warmer. The first thing that catches our interest is look at this spike in pine pollen. So pines become more common. And maybe that was the effect of there were some droughts and fires, and pines are faster growing. They're replacing some of the other conifers. But then they just decline very quickly. And over about 3,000 years, this forest goes from being largely conifer to largely oak. And this tracks with what we see across California. Oaks are more common in warmer climates, and really gives us that signal of how responsive vegetation is to a changing climate. But the other important part of this signal is if vegetation has 3,000 years, we can see major changes occur. Right now in this century, and this is what we'll come to by the end of today, we are looking at changes that could happen in 30 years or 100 years, or even with 300 years. 300 years would be way beyond our time scale. And yet when we look at the fossil record, what we see is vegetation change that takes thousands of years. So this question of how fast change is occurring is central to everything we think about climate change and conservation. So let me run through this view of these 8 different periods in California. Well, the first one is this very long period from the end of the Ice Age all the way through to 1500. That, of course, covers an enormous sweep of history, a lot of changes in climate. But 3 things are happening through that period. It's warming up. And if you look at that picture of the coastline, for example, the Farallon were just some hills out on the coast. San Francisco Bay was a deep valley with rivers running out of it, and the coastline was 20 miles out off of San Francisco. So the geography was different. California was filled with mega herbivores. You look at one of these images that come from the folks who reconstruct from the La Brea tar pits, for example. It looks like Africa, except some of the animals are a little strange. So think of California as an African savanna covered in large herbivores. Well, that's a totally different world. And then right in this period, the archaeological evidence is humans arrive across the Bering Strait and spread all across North and South America. And we know from Native Americans that their own understanding is that they have lived in these places from time immemorial. And that just reflects if nothing else, it reflects the depth of knowledge. I mean, think of thousands of generations living on the landscape and the kind of knowledge that accumulates. And then Europeans sitting here with just 500 years, and even that, through very rapid change, cultural change. So this depth of knowledge and influence. We know Native Americans had an enormous influence on the landscape, and a lot of use of fire, harvesting an enormous range of resources. But what I want to reflect on for right now when we think about conservation is conservationists often get into discussions of what's the baseline. Where did things start before, say, Europeans arrived? And I think that notion of any baseline in California is very elusive. It was cold. There were animals, there were people, it was warming up, most of the animals went extinct. I mean, where in that period would we say is a baseline? And maybe do we even need to answer that question? Because certainly we can see that this would have been an incredibly dynamic environment over thousands of years. So Europeans arrive, and I found this map, which really shows the European, the mostly Spanish shipping expeditions across the Pacific. And really what it highlights in thinking about this period, the 1500s through to the late 1700s, is the Spanish were mostly traveling by ship and passing by California, stopping for water, stopping for possibly for fresh food. We know that some of the first European plants already jumped off those ships and were already spreading as invasive plants in California. But very limited settlement, but already a lot of contact with Native Americans. And we know that the contact happened throughout this time, even before Spanish really arrived as a colonial force much later. There's a little, one note about this is I had a chance to go on a cruise around the Farallons and learn that one of the Spanish shipping captains was coming south and ran aground on the Farallons. And what they put in the log is when you come to Point Reyes, always swing out to the west and go around the Farallons. Don't go to the east because there's rocks. And that's one of the reasons the Spanish never discovered San Francisco Bay in all those centuries, is the ship captains were all told to avoid the Farallons and go out to sea and go around them. And they never realized that they were missing the entrance to this spectacular harbor right here in San Francisco. So this changes we can date to 1768 when Junipero Serra led both a religious and military colonial force coming from Mexico, the establishment of the missions, and what really also becomes the beginning of devastating impact on Native American populations. And a lot of Native Americans forced into missions, forced labor, and forced conversion to Christianity, and really the beginning of what has been a real devastation of culture and populations. If we think about what was happening on the landscape, the beyond the agriculture happening on the missions, one of the main activities of the Spanish was bringing in very, very large herds of cattle who were set to roam free, especially across the coast ranges, and then brought in great big roundups and brought down to the beaches, slaughtered for the hides. I'm sure the meat was eaten. And the hides were shipped actually around the Horn back to the East Coast, processed into shoe leather, and then other goods were brought from the East Coast. And then the clipper ships would come back around with the goods. So California was exporting raw materials and being an importer of manufactured goods, much as other colonies are in their relationships to colonial powers, whether Europe or the Eastern United States. And if you've never read 2 Years Before the Mast, this is a remarkable account of what California is like in the 1830s in the midst of the Spanish cattle ranching operations and before the gold rush and the American takeover. Quite a remarkable story. In mid-19th century, a history well known to those who live and grow up here, or if your children do their required California fourth grade history, with the discovery of gold, which was happening just at the same moment that the United States was engaged in a fairly aggressive relationship with Mexico. The Mexican-American War was already being triggered, even just as gold was discovered. So it all sort of came together in that moment. And it leads to a period over I'm shaping this period from 1849, from the gold rush, to about 1915, the 1910s, a period of really enormous environmental transformation, devastating exploitation of resources. So first we see hydraulic mining, for example, just cutting down entire landscapes. And this, of course, leaves these scars in the Sierra Nevada. Sometimes they don't really look like a scar anymore. They look like an exposed hillside along Highway 80. You see places that only when you look at the maps or see the history realize that what we're seeing are what was left behind by this hydraulic mining. In this period, the American and Californian government also engaged in sponsored genocide of California Indians. Slavery, there was a form of slavery of Indians that was legal in California. And this is something that we're really grappling with more now, including the fact that our governor issued the first apology for genocide only in the last 4 or 5 years, recognizing what this period was like. And Native Americans by the end of the 19th century have been reduced from hundreds of thousands to less than 30,000 likely in California. The other thing about this period is there was widespread logging. All of the Tahoe Basin is logged for the mines in Nevada, for example. A lot of redwood logging for building San Francisco, rebuilding it after each fire, and extensive clearing for cattle grazing. So this is the hills behind the UC Berkeley campus. And you can see it's entirely grassland with a few oaks down along Strawberry Creek. And I think there's this interesting tension that climate scientists think of the end of the 19th century as a climate baseline. So 1870 to 1900 is sometimes framed as the baseline for climate because we hadn't started burning a lot of fossil fuels yet. So there's the pre-fossil fuel climate baseline. But again, like I was saying about even the earlier periods, as a biological baseline, it's actually in some ways, I think this period, or right around the turn of the century, may have been a low point for many California ecosystems, just in the sense of deforestation, destruction of wildlife, widespread hunting. The grizzly is driven extinct, the large herds of elk, pronghorn, so certainly for large mammals. So there's this moment where the exploitation of resources is really dominant. Conservation, which we'll get to next, hasn't really started. And right around the turn of the century is a period when I think in many ways, a lot of ecosystems probably turned a corner towards a kind of recovery. And I said there's a tension there because I think for many of us, we live in a moment where we just feel like it's constant decline, like everything in the environment is in decline, under threat. And there's a lot of threats, and we'll talk about those. But I grew up in New England. And for example, the 19th century saw a complete deforestation of most of New England, and now New England is almost entirely forested. So it's also important to recognize the ways in which the devastation of this period in history has been followed by a certain kind of recovery of a lot of ecosystems, certainly a return of a lot of forests to areas where they've been cut down. Of course, all secondary forests in the sense of how old they are. So from that period in the early 20th century, we see the first wave of modern conservation. This is driven by John Muir and the celebration of wilderness, by Gifford Pinchot, and the beginning of the wise use movement, multiple use, which characterizes Bureau of Land Management lands, Forest Service lands. Teddy Roosevelt as a champion of conservation. Of course, he was a great white hunter. So, this is conservation coming from a moment when it's still also tied up in exploiting and consuming some of those same resources. But this is a real turning point when the first major national parks and the national forests are all set aside, and the government really begins to sort of take control of more of that landscape and put a halt to some of the kinds of exploitation that had been underway in the 19th century. We take that through World War II, but of course, this is also another very important period as the spread, as cars become the dominant form of transportation. California becomes a car-loving state as it continues today. So towards around World War II and coming out of World War II, we also see the beginning of the real spread of suburbanization and the spread of housing. And land use has been and remains the major and most significant threat to biodiversity in California and most of the world. Climate change is catching up and will likely surpass that, but we really have to recognize that what we see in a picture like this is where the most important habitat habitat loss has happened, certainly in the last 100 years. I think most people would date the modern environmental movement to the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, the alert about pesticides, the impacts on birds. That happens just in the early 60s, that then gathers steam with anti-war movements and the youth activism of the late 60s leads to the first Earth Day. So here we have the modern environmental movement really arising in this moment as a collective celebration of the environment, a sense that we're doing enormous harm to the environment and need to put a stop to this. This then leads to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act. We should never forget that all three of those are signed under President Nixon or signed by President Nixon. And through the 60s and 70s and 80s, then these laws really begin to take effect. We have enormous successes. If we go back and look at water pollution in the 50s and air pollution in Los Angeles, even Strawberry Creek on the Berkeley campus would run with sewage and run with chemical waste in the 1950s. And these laws really turn the corner in really important ways. I mean, there are ways in which there are aspects of our environment that are so much cleaner in the United States than they were in the 50s or 60s. And of course, we see in India or China, that image of what this looks like when there haven't been those kinds of laws in terms of air pollution, and they're undertaking the same kinds of work today. Towards the end of this period, though, this also leads to a lot of conflict, and that conflict in the West is maybe best captured in the timber wars. So the spotted owl declaration as a threatened species and the conflict with logging in the Pacific Northwest leads to a period of enormous tension. That's its own story when we look at how that played out in Western forests. But it leads to another period that starts in the 1990s. I just gave it this name, balanced conservation. I don't know if others have another name for it, where there was really a realization that this couldn't be fought species by species or site by site, and it couldn't just become a sort of fight to the death between environmentalists and developers, and led to a period of very structured, strategic conservation planning. California led the way in a lot of this. San Diego, it was a leader. The National Community Conservation Plan in 1995 is, I believe, the first published regional plan that could accommodate where development would happen, where conservation would happen. And if you look at the report, it's published by San Diego Gas and Electric. So a major company is sort of in a lead role to develop and publish a conservation plan at a landscape scale, and then leads to things like mitigation banking, incredibly important in California. If you want to develop land here, develop, for farming or for industry, well, you need to invest and pay for setting aside land somewhere else. And that mitigation banking has led to enormous conservation successes. But it meant conservation and development were really tied together in a way that was very different than some of the conflict that was emerging in the 80s. Now, this period also, we see climate change emerging, and the way it emerged for Californians, I think most dramatically, is in wildfire. So any of those who remember the fires in San Diego, 2004 or 5, some very, very catastrophic fires in terms of home loss. But for most Californians, it was the Rim Fire in 2013 that just it was just this wake-up call. The scale of the fire, the size of the fire. 2013, 2015 lake fires, 2017 wine country fires, 2020 Bay Area fires, North Complex, Mendocino Complex, Caldor Fire, Dixie Fire. Just to think that the Rim Fire is actually only 10 years ago, because now that just seems like we've just lived a whole lifetime in the spread of and the expansion of large wildfires in California. And then in that same period, the drought we'll talk about later, the really severe drought in the 2012, 2015. So climate change is really emerging, coming on our radar as something that's going to really change the way we interact with the environment. And then leads to what I would say, we are emerging into a new era of conservation. In the last 2 years, I've had the privilege of chairing the California Biodiversity Network. And that network is a group of academics and agency scientists and NGO scientists who've been providing in a support role to the state of California in pursuit of 30 by 30. 30 by 30 is the commitment to conserve 30% of terrestrial lands and 30% of waters by 2030. It's a very ambitious goal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details of this strategy here in California. What I really want to point you to is this conservation framework. And this was captured in an executive order issued by Governor Newsom 3 years ago. The 3 objectives of 30 by 30 for California, and note that this is a sort of a goal that's been embraced by countries around the world just recently in the Biodiversity Congress in Montreal last December. The 3 objectives for California: protect and restore biodiversity, expand access to nature, and mitigate and build resilience to climate change. So it's really capturing the fact that in this moment, that conservation going forward has a biodiversity goal, as it always has, but we have to be much more thoughtful about who is benefiting. Protected lands and parks have largely been playgrounds for the better educated and higher income and mostly white communities in the United States. And it's changing because California is changing, and our strategies and our goals are changing. And the explicit goal of thinking about who benefits from conservation and who benefits from parks is embedded. And the protection of biodiversity has to be tied to dealing with climate change. This is the shift we're in right now. And that point about access runs deeper. The core commitments to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, to strengthen tribal partnerships, and always with an eye to economic prosperity, is embedded in this. Just last week, we hosted the 30 by 30 partnership gathering, a joint effort of the California Natural Resources Agency, California Biodiversity Network in Riverside. And it just felt electric in the room. The nature of the dialogue, quite a few representatives of tribal groups who were there speaking on panels, the questions that were being asked, how are we doing this? What are our goals? And I really came away from that meeting with that really energized feeling that we've made a transition. And this is not a coincidence that it's tied to 2020. This comes out of the murder of George Floyd. We're in a moment of sort of a third wave of civil rights in the United States, and we're in the middle of a third or fourth wave, maybe depending on how you count, of biodiversity conservation, certainly here in California. And it's an exciting moment, but we have some big challenges ahead. And those we will be talking about in the remaining units. So with that, I will wrap up the first module of our workshop today. Thank you very much.